There's a generation walking among us right now that almost nobody talks about. Not because they're boring, not because they don't matter, but because they were literally trained from childhood to not be noticed. Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980, sandwiched between the massive cultural footprint of the baby boomers and the endless media fascination with millennials. And if you ask most people to describe them, you get a shrug. But here's what nobody tells you. Gen X might be the most psychologically complex generation alive today. And understanding them reveals something profound, not just about who they are, but about how childhood shapes the adult brain in ways we're only beginning to fully understand. Let's start at the beginning. Picture a typical Tuesday afternoon in 1976. School just let out. A 9-year-old walks home alone, lets herself in with the key around her neck, makes a peanut butter sandwich, and sits down to watch television. Alone. For 3 hours. Her parents aren't neglectful. They're working. Both of them. Because by the mid-1970s, dual-income households had shifted from a luxury to a necessity. And an entire generation of children came home to empty houses every single day. Researchers called them latchkey kids. And by 1984, studies estimated that approximately 7 million American children between ages 5 and 13 were regularly unsupervised after school. That's not a handful of kids. That's an entire psychological cohort being shaped by the same invisible force: solitude. Now here's where it gets psychologically interesting. Developmental psychologists have long understood that the environment a child grows up in doesn't just affect behavior. It literally rewires the architecture of the developing brain. When you spend years making decisions alone, managing your own time, solving your own problems, your brain doesn't develop the same neural pathways as a child who always has an adult nearby to defer to. Gen X developed what psychologists call an internalized locus of control earlier and more deeply than any previous generation. The belief that your outcomes depend on your own actions, not on external forces or other people. That single psychological shift explains almost everything about how they operate as adults. If you're finding this fascinating, hit subscribe and click the notification bell. We go this deep every single week. But solitude was only the first layer. Because while Gen X was coming home to empty houses, the world outside was sending a very specific message. Nothing is permanent. Divorce rates in America climbed steeply through the 1970s, peaking in 1980 at a rate nearly double what it had been in 1960. Many Gen X children didn't just watch this from a distance. They lived inside it. Parents who had promised forever suddenly didn't. Families that seemed stable quietly fractured. Kids who had already learned to be alone now learned something more unsettling: that the adults in their lives couldn't always be counted on. Then came the corporate betrayals. Gen X watched their parents give decades of loyalty to companies that handed them layoff notices during the restructuring waves of the 1980s. They saw the unspoken contract between worker and employer dissolve in real time. Psychologists have a term for what happens when children repeatedly witness promised stability collapse. It's called adaptive cynicism. The mind learns to protect itself by lowering expectations before disappointment can arrive uninvited. This isn't depression. This isn't pessimism for its own sake. It's the brain doing exactly what it's designed to do, building a model of the world based on observed patterns and preparing accordingly. This is why Gen X plans for worst-case scenarios instinctively. Why they maintain emergency funds, backup plans, exit strategies. Why they seem allergic to naive optimism. They're not being difficult. Their brains are doing what decades of experience trained them to do. Now add one more ingredient: public catastrophe at a formative age. Gen X came of age under the shadow of the Cold War, not as abstract history, but as daily psychological reality. Duck and cover drills in elementary school, news cycles saturated with nuclear threat, adults speaking casually about civilizational collapse. Then came AIDS, emerging in the early 1980s, just as the oldest Gen Xers were entering adulthood, completely mishandled by the institutions meant to protect people. Then Watergate. Then Iran-Contra. Scandal after scandal revealing that the people in charge were either incompetent or corrupt or both. What does that do to a developing mind? It creates what researchers call institutional distrust, a deep-seated skepticism toward authority that isn't reflexive rebellion, but earned suspicion. Gen X doesn't distrust authority because they're contrarian. They distrust it because they watched authority fail repeatedly during the years when their beliefs about the world were being formed. Here's the crucial nuance. Institutional distrust doesn't mean they don't respect anyone. Gen X respects competence ferociously. If you've genuinely earned your position through skill and demonstrated ability, they will follow you. But a title alone means nothing. A corner office without the track record gets zero deference because they learned young that authority and capability are not the same thing. So how did they cope with all of this? They developed irony, not as a personality quirk, as a psychological defense mechanism. Irony allows you to engage with something painful while maintaining emotional distance. It lets you acknowledge absurdity without being destroyed by it. When the adults around you are talking about nuclear annihilation, but telling you not to worry, irony becomes almost a survival tool. You hold the contradiction at arm's length, make the joke, and keep moving. This is why Gen X humor tends to be dry, self-aware, and slightly detached. Why they seem unfazed by things that provoke intense emotional responses in younger generations. They're not emotionally cold. They built an armor, and that armor served them extraordinarily well. But armor has a cost. Research published in the Journal of Adult Development found that Gen Xers report significantly lower rates of seeking social support during periods of stress. Not because they lack relationships. They often have deep, fiercely loyal friendships forged when parents were absent. But asking for help feels, on a visceral level, like admitting their self-reliance has failed. And self-reliance is the core identity they built everything else around. And then there's their relationship with work. Gen X doesn't talk about work the way millennials and Gen Z do. They don't post about hustle culture. They don't perform their ambition publicly. They don't expect work to be fulfilling in a spiritual sense. They just show up and do it. This was forged through early experiences of actual labor. Paper routes before sunrise, grocery bagging, fast food shifts where you calculated change in your head because the register broke and nobody was coming to fix it. These weren't internships. They were introductions to a world that didn't care how you felt, only whether you showed up. And because they watched their parents' generation get discarded by companies despite decades of loyalty, Gen X never bought into corporate identity the way previous generations did. They're loyal to their own competence, not to any institution. They can't control whether layoffs happen, but they can control whether they're skilled enough to land on their feet when they do. This is why Gen X is more likely to maintain multiple income streams, update their skills continuously, and plan for contingencies that younger workers haven't considered. Here's the paradox that makes Gen X genuinely unique. They are simultaneously the most self-reliant generation and the most quietly generous. They will never ask for help. They will figure it out alone. They have been doing that since they were 8 years old, coming home to an empty house. But if you are struggling, they will show up. Without announcement, without posting about it, without needing recognition, they'll just appear, fix the thing, and leave. Because that's what you do. You handle it. That's not a performance. That's not brand building. That's who they actually are. And maybe that's what makes them so hard to see. In a cultural moment that rewards visibility, Gen X remains stubbornly invisible. Not because they have nothing to offer, but because they were shaped in a time when privacy meant safety, when restraint was wisdom, when doing the work mattered more than being seen doing it. They are the bridge generation, raised in the analog world, forced to adapt to the digital one, old enough to remember life before connectivity, young enough to have built the technology that followed. Bridges don't ask to be admired. They just hold the weight. If you've ever had a Gen X colleague, parent, or friend quietly solve a problem that everyone else was panicking about, without a sound, without taking credit, you've already seen that psychological profile in practice. You just may not have known what you were looking at. If this gave you a new way of seeing the people around you, subscribe. These deep dives take time to make, and your support makes them possible.